Hello and welcome to this session where we're going to be talking about the Futures We Want project that we've been working on collaboratively over the last almost 6 months. Today I'm going to be talking about this project with Dr. Siobhan Gardiner. Welcome, Siobhan. Dr. Siobhan Gardiner is a director in Deloitte Sustainability and Climate Change Practice. She specialises in technology enablement and innovation. Her background is in food systems and climate resilience, and she's had more than 10 years of research and development experience across various different types of companies, including startup development. She's also involved in academic research in climate and sustainability. She's involved in a number of exciting partnerships including collaborations and university partnerships, which include everything from climate justice, wildlife conservation, carbon capture and measurement, circular economy and smart agriculture, to name a few, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer questions about any of that at the end too. Welcome, Siobhan.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce you. This is Amy Munro-Faure. She is the Living Laboratory Engagement Manager at Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge. So Amy's academic background is in behavioural science, biodiversity and conservation. And she leads on education and student engagement by providing opportunities for students as well as graduates interested in climate change to gain a relevant experience. So the Living Lab itself seeks to improve environmental sustainability on the university estate, whilst also providing opportunities for students through educational programs, research projects, internships, and also entrepreneurial competitions. Amy is also involved in a variety of strategic projects ranging from understanding regional climate risk to UK public attitudes to net zero. And today we would like to introduce you all to the Futures We Want project. And as we run through our session, please do post your questions in the chat and we will come to a Q&A at the end. If we could move to the next slide, please, Kieran. So this project is all about imagining a globally net zero climate resilient future that people actually want to live in. So to ask the question, what does a feasible, desirable and climate resilient net zero future look like? Moving to the next slide, and following several months of international collaboration between academics, business, civil society and citizens across the globe, the Futures We Want project will be showcased at the COP26 summit that kicks off in Glasgow very soon, and we are hugely excited. The project was commissioned by the UK in its role as COP26 president via the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS, and is led by a consortium of partners consisting of Deloitte, ACOM, Cambridge, One Young World, ACNE and RY. We also work very closely with a number of esteemed academic experts from each of the focus regions of the project, which proved extremely enlightening, and we are forever grateful for their time and dedication to the project. Their vast knowledge and expertise ranged from physical climate risk, biodiversity and environmental sciences, through to public health, economics, water, energy and food systems, to name a few. On the next slide, you will see that the visions cover a series of cross-cutting themes and span across 6 geographic regions across 5 continents, namely the Arabian Peninsula, which specifically focused on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Brazil, India, Jamaica, Kenya, and the UK. They were chosen by the UK government to reflect the diversity of challenges and opportunities in building a sustainable future. And the visions highlight some of the innovations that could make a net zero future a reality and explore what science can tell us about the wide-ranging benefits of achieving this future. So returning to our big questions on the next slide, we sought to investigate firstly, what can we do about this? And then ask the question, what do we want to do? And moving on to a quick summary of how we did this. On the next slide, thank you, Kieran. Firstly, Cambridge convened our academic experts from across the globe to build an evidence base and identify some of the most interesting innovations being used around the world to address climate change. And then we proceeded to share those findings with citizens within each region, including local business owners and government representatives, youth, women, and marginalised communities. This is the first time this kind of collaboration has happened, and our approach really stems from the need to address the importance of inclusivity in the global climate conversation. and ensuring that we are listening in and amplifying a rich diversity of voices. Because our journey to a global net zero future must be a just transition, and it was critical in this project to build in local environmental, social, and economic context for each region. Amy, I'm now handing back to you to take us through some of the outcomes of the work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Siobhan. So I now get the really exciting bit, which is telling you about what were some of the things that we found that when we got all of our expert opinion together and all of the evidence that we gathered, and we'd gone off and done these workshops with people, what did we think? What was a desirable, feasible future? And I'm going to start off by talking about the Arabian Peninsula. Now, as you can imagine, the Arabian Peninsula is very filled with desert. So some of the kind of innovations that we really highlighted or really came out through the work were very much focused around that. So we saw, for example, some thought about the innovations around greener deserts. So we've got desert, can we use those deserts for agriculture? Can we think about vertical farming in cities? There were some really interesting innovations in places like Dubai, thinking about can we get plants growing but in vertical ways. Obviously within this region, you've also got a huge problem with water security. You need to have enough water for people to live, but there's also tensions around, again, water for agriculture. Where does that water come from? We're thinking about seawater greenhouses. Can we supply greenhouses with seawater? Where can we desalinate water in a way that's climatically effective and that's carbon neutral? Another major theme that came up here, not only here, but also in Jamaica, was restored mangroves. Can we use mangroves to really enhance resilience of coastal regions, creating resilience against sea level rise, creating resilience against storm surge, and so on and so forth, as well as boosting biodiversity. And finally, and perhaps most obviously for an intensely sunny region, we've got solar thermal power generation. So how much of this land can we use to generate solar power? And how much of that energy that we will need to power life in 2050 can come from solar power? And what potential is there for exporting solar power from the Arabian Peninsula to other parts of the world? And that's a really, really interesting and open question. Moving on to Brazil, I think that Brazil is most famous for, as you all know, is the Amazon rainforest. So, and yet there's a huge tension at the moment in Brazil about there being a just transition and ensuring that there is fairness for farmers. So I think a huge part of the conversation and evidence that we pulled together in Brazil was about sustainable agriculture. And we've got the phrase sustainable agriculture potency here. So how can we ensure that we've got the massive carbon sink that the Amazon rainforest represents and all of the biodiversity that might have countless different functions in the future that's there, and make sure that we've got that, but in such a way that we can still use some of that land for agriculture to continue to feed the world. I've touched on the Amazon already and biodiversity, but we've got another thing in here about innovative businesses that harness the Amazon's biodiversity. And this is absolutely vast. So that could be anything from discovering a new bacteria that can fight other types of infection in ways that we don't even think of at the moment. Thinking about what are those instances of life sciences that we can pull out of the Amazon and use to enhance our development and progression going forwards. The Amazon has one of the highest rates of, has one of the largest numbers of different types of species in the world. It's home to so much biodiversity, and there's loads of possibilities for how we can pull that out, but we need to conserve it in order to be able to do that. Final thing that we really thought about in Brazil was green infrastructure, raising the standard of living of every Brazilian. So this is really thinking about how can we ensure that there is infrastructure that allows people to lead decent lives? How can we ensure that the cities in Brazil are filled with green space, but also that the way in which urban spaces and built environment is designed allows people to lead lives where they're able to travel actively, where they're able to access the education they want, and so on and so forth. Moving on to India. In India, we had a really interesting focus starting to think about lots of nature-based solutions to some of the problems that we face with climate in India. India has probably uniquely amongst this group a really, really challenging problem with a just transition to a net zero future. You've got all sorts of really complex issues to try and negotiate in India around things like the number of people who are currently employed in the coal industry and how we can transition to a net zero future with that challenge in place. So we started to look at really exciting opportunities around things like agroforestry. Is there an opportunity to, say, for example, have forestry, which can do carbon capture, alongside agriculture in the same physical space? There were some really interesting examples that are already happening in some communities of traditional organic soil composting in the Himalayas. How can we extend that? Is that something that we can take to other parts of the Himalayas, other parts of India? And again, we had this focus on green infrastructure, on things like electric bikes, how we can create decent lives for people going forward, as well as thinking about things like solar homes, ensuring that all homes have solar panels, and wetland waste systems. There's a really interesting project in Western India, where a wetland basically filters all the water in that system and enables it to be used as clean water. And moving on to Jamaica. So here we have the mangroves again, that again, we touched on mangroves in the Arabian Peninsula, but Jamaica was a really, in this project was quite unique because it was the only example of a region that was an island, and an island that is really, really at risk from climate change already. So it's already experiencing a much higher level of storms and possibility of storm surge than many of the other regions that we looked at. So we really started to think about resilience and natural protection from those storms through mangrove swamps, as well as the boosted biodiversity that you get from mangrove swamps. We also thought a great deal about things like energy independence for rural communities within Jamaica. The vast majority of communities are distributed around the coast. And yet there are instances where, say, for example, the infrastructure for energy is still not really there. So how do we increase that resilience of energy production to ensure that people can continue to develop as we go towards net zero? And finally, the other piece in Jamaica is that agriculture is still hugely important in Jamaica. So how can we ensure that the types of crops that are being grown there are resilient and continue to be resilient to more parasitic and disease threats as we go forward? Moving on to Kenya. Kenya was again a completely different environment. We're into Africa, we're thinking about things like agriculture and again developments, and the academics in Kenya took a really interesting attitude to this, but they really thought about it from a perspective of the built environment and then from the perspective of essentially agriculture and rural regions, and how could you then think about all of the holistic pieces that make up the climate challenge and the solutions we might need to find for it in those two environments. So we thought about things like having natural landscapes for indigenous crops, but by the same measure also thought about things like accessible healthcare systems that will allow people to survive in the changing climate as it gets hotter and hotter. Again, there was also a focus on solar infrastructure powering towns and communities and thinking about rural and urban linkages. I think there were some really interesting opportunities in Kenya. For example, the power network. The power network in Kenya is actually already very largely renewable, is already very largely based on renewables. But what that doesn't tell you is that there's an awful lot of people using generators to power themselves in Kenya. So how can we think about those more isolated communities and then think through how we could use renewable power systems in those instances? So again, really thinking about what's appropriate for the geography and what both the social and the physical environment can tell you in terms of what are the solutions that are available. And finally, moving on to the United Kingdom. So in the UK, this is probably, I'm guessing for most of the participants on this call, the one that we know best. So the kind of examples that we are thinking about are some things that are to an extent already happening, but things like having networks of wind farms that are going to power the country going forwards, thinking about having a sharing economy, which I don't think we're really there yet with that, but spans anything from furniture to clothes. So how do we ensure that we reuse and don't overconsume in terms of the resources that we use, and also thinking about all of the co-benefits that go alongside this, so allowing people to live healthier lives, get out into nature, and do things like active transport, cycle and walk to where they need to go to. Could I have the next slide, please? Kieran, could I have the next slide? Thank you. Lovely. So moving on, I'm then going to run through relatively swiftly the 4 cross-cutting themes that we mentioned. So starting off with energy. So I've touched on some of the energy themes throughout the regions, but we think that out of the results of this project, our relationship with energy is really likely to be quite different in 2050. We're thinking that we're going to have a far greater proportion of renewable sources of energy powering much more of our energy production. We're still going to need to use energy in 2050, but that energy is going to be lower carbon. We're also going to need to be thinking about some other sources of energy that we're not currently thinking about. So things like green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced by electrolysis of water, and that electrolysis being driven by renewable energy. So actually, if we can then burn that hydrogen to power, say, for example, vehicles, that could potentially produce a really, really interesting nexus of technologies working together. There's another piece in here about battery technologies and the research that's going to be needed to get battery technology to a place where it's going to be really, really transformative in terms of our society. So if we're able to generate renewable energy from solar and wind power, that's great. But if we're not able to store it, when the wind stops blowing or it's nighttime, we need some way to be able to use that energy at points when we need it in order to not experience a very, very radical transformation in terms of how we live our lives. The final piece that goes along with that storage piece is the investments that are going to be necessary in major infrastructure globally. So one piece that we often talk about is electrification of transport, and how if you want to give everyone an electric car, even just within the UK, the national grid and the national infrastructure we have at the moment is insufficient to be able to power that. So there also needs to be a piece thinking about, okay, so how do we ensure that our power grids are going to be able to cope with these new demands that are placed upon them, whether that be through the integration of storage, or whether that's through a much higher need in terms of electricity rather than power that has conventionally or have traditionally come from gas. Next slide, please. So land and food. So this is an area that I think is really interesting, because I think it is really going to highlight how we're going to think about land over the next 30 years. So the top point you've got in here is prioritization between different land uses. We have a limited amount of land that we're going to be able to use globally, and several distinct uses that we're going to need to use that land for. So that's growing food, that's land for sustainable and renewable energy like solar farms. That's also things like biodiversity and conserving biodiversity when we're thinking about places like Brazil. That's also maybe places where we might want to build homes. It's also maybe places where we might want to use for leisure. So we have all of these different needs that we're going to have from our land. So how do we prioritize that, and how do we answer that question about how we prioritize our land at a global level, at a national level, at a regional level? Does that have different answers in different places? How does that work together in a whole system? I think that's a really, really big question that we're looking to answer. I think in terms of land and food, we're going to be looking to have restored coastal and marine ecosystems. We've already talked quite a lot about mangroves here and the value that they can have for resilience. So thinking about that and thinking about that in other places, thinking about wetlands and the role that they can have for flood prevention as well as clean water. In terms of land and food, we're also going to be thinking about new farming techniques. Some of my favourite examples of new farming techniques, some of the really niche tech ones about tiny little farming robots that can walk gently along the soil to stop the soil structure from being destroyed like a big tractor might. But then again, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and there's many, many examples of new farming techniques that are far less technologically advanced than that. Thinking about that example from the Himalayas that we talked about with the compost, for example, is a great one. I think there's also going to be some really interesting economic changes in terms of how we think about land, with farmers being encouraged and rewarded to protect ecosystems, whether that be for carbon capture or for biodiversity purposes, and switch to more sustainable forms of agriculture, bringing out that example from Brazil again. And all of this is going to need to be facilitated through changes to both government policy, but also through individual choices about how individual choices that farmers make, but also our individual choices as consumers in terms of the end products that we are asking for, basically, and how that drives the whole system. Next slide, please. So on water, climate change is going to impact both water availability and flood risk, with the general takeaways being that fresh water is going to be less available, and we're going to be at a higher risk of flood risk. So I think globally, as we approach 2050, we're going to need to be seeing all sorts of different innovations put in place to manage and mitigate these risks. So we're going to see new infrastructure for things like water storage, and that is going to range from having small water storage units in rural communities through to thinking about how we can use nature-based solutions to store water. It's going to be thinking about water conservation policies globally, and ensuring and thinking through how we think about how we use water in urban settings. Can we use low flow devices to minimize our water use? On the flip side of that, we're also going to be thinking about things like major investment in flood defences. And by that, we're both talking about hard defences and seawalls, but everything right through to the nature-based interventions. And again, some of that work that I've been talking about on mangroves. And next slide, please. And just to finish off on this section on some of the findings of the work that we pulled together, to finish off on the built environment. Our built environment, where we live, is intrinsically linked to climate. The built environment has a carbon footprint. Both cement and steel, for example, are both heavily carbon intensive materials to produce. We also need to think about our built environment's ability to withstand more challenging and unpredictable weather. When the wind blows hard, when there's lots of rain, when there's a storm surge, when there's a flood, how does our built environment withstand that? And the other piece, and one of the pieces that I think is really interesting, is some of the commentary that we also got, some evidence we also gathered about how the built environment determines how people are able to lead low carbon lives, how the design of the built environment encourages people to use active travel or to engage with their communities in a way that is emotionally satisfying to them, which might lead to other types of behaviour change. So in 2050, we're imagining that we're going to see greener cities, cities that, like that example in Dubai of the vertical farming, or the example in Brazil of having more green space in cities, that we're going to see cities that have more green in them, that make use of things like the fact that trees can provide shade to provide cooling to buildings. I think we're going to see more use of smart technologies. I think there's going to be some really interesting innovations in things like AI and how we use transport and how water and transport are controlled within cities. And finally, I think this is all going to, again, be underpinned by more robust building standards. So we see examples of this in places like the UK, the Passive House Standard, for example, which aims to make buildings essentially passive in terms of their heating needs. So they need very, very, very little or none, no additional heating. But I think we're going to need to see, in order to get there, more robust building standards on a national and international level to enshrine these innovations in how we go about living our lives in an urban environment. That's pretty much all I wanted to say in terms of the findings that we've got. It's a bit of a whistle-top tour of some of the things that we found, and there's an awful lot more to dig into. But I'm going to hand back over to Siobhan, who's got a few more comments to make, I think.
Thank you very much. Now, on the next slide is a question that we probably should be all asking ourselves, and that is, how can we contribute to a net zero future? And we know that we need to collaborate internationally and across government, business, technology, and society more broadly. But I hope this work will help us to think about the opportunities that a net zero future might bring and understand how we will all be impacted by the changes in climate, such as those highlighted by the 4 cross-cutting themes identified in this work. And understanding how this impact will come about, hopefully, will help us decide what changes could be made, whether that be how we live, how we work and travel, how we spend, or how we use energy. But Amy, this is the Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival. So what are your thoughts on the opportunity here?
Thanks for that. I think Cambridge has a really unique proposition as a place. I think that we have the university and all of the interesting research that goes on there, but I also think that we have the technology hubs that exist around Cambridge and the huge number of innovative thinkers in that part of the private sector as well. And I think that there's a huge number of people that think about these issues, both in terms of how we go about living our lives, whether that's how you run a business, whether that's how you do your work in the university, but also I think there's a whole bunch of really interesting organisations that have this net zero future as an explicit part of their mission. I'm biased because I work for one of them, but I think there really are. I think there's a really unique environment that's starting to be generated here, and I think that the question that I have is, what are the opportunities for us within Cambridge to begin to answer some of these questions? Where are the opportunities where we can pull together some of the amazing intelligence and brains and drive that people have to answer these questions in a really fundamental way that's going to drive forward progress and answer in getting to a net zero future? And I suppose that's the question that I have at the end of this to ask you, but I think there's also an opportunity for you to ask us some questions too.
Yes, we do have time, hopefully, for a couple of questions. Like Claire mentioned, please do post them in the chat. I think we can see that some are coming through already, but perhaps to kick us off, then Amy, could you tell us a bit more about what Cambridge Zero is doing for COP26 and perhaps taking up to Glasgow?
Yes, absolutely. The answer is, as far as I can tell, absolutely loads. And I think we're coming at it from several different levels. I think that one of the main things that we've really wanted to do with COP26 is to support academics from across the university in getting their voice into COP26 where that's relevant. So I think there's been an awful lot of work partly through some things like the Futures We Want project, but also through our director, Emily Shapper's work in terms of engaging directly with policymakers, alongside talking to other academics and ensuring that we're presenting in a cohesive way to policymakers at COP26. So there's an element of which is about engaging with policymakers. There's an element of which is about engaging with business. There's also an element which I've been more involved in, which has been about students and students' voices. And there's a couple of really exciting projects which are much closer to home for me, one of which is a film called Act Now, which we've been collaborating on with the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge and the Policy Institute down in Bath. And that film is essentially about youth voice. So we had 150 submissions from young climate activists from, I think it was 40 countries around the world. And those are being developed into a film which talks about their hopes, their fears, and their message for global policymakers. And that's going to be shown in the Green Zone, COP26. So that's one that I am personally very proud of and really excited about. Another student project that's making its way to COP26 is a student that I've been working with who's really interested in green careers and what the future of green careers are going to be. There's been a COP26 Universities network in the UK that's been producing a series of briefing papers on all sorts of different topics. And one part of that is about education, and there's going to be an education and careers event in the Green Zone at COP26, and the students' films are going to be part of that. And that's a really, really exciting example of where we work with both students, we've worked with other universities, and it's going to be there in this forum. And I think that's been a really, really exciting offer for us and for me at the moment. So I haven't answered the big policy question as well, but the student bit is great.
Awesome. There's a sort of follow-up question to that, which is how can I attend COP or support COP activities? So just to comment on that quickly. So yes, there's going to be lots of events happening in and around Glasgow, but it's also possible to join in on those events entirely virtually from wherever you are in the world. So please do go visit the Cambridge Zero website to find out what's going on during the course of the summit, but also the visions work that we are doing. We are collaborating with the Resilience Hub, which is in the Blue Zone where the negotiations are taking place. And that is a program events that you can actually join entirely virtually, which you can sign up for online as well. So I'm afraid we're 2 minutes over, so I'm afraid we are going to have to close the Q&A at this point. But if we could just move to the next slide, please, you'll see the all-important link to the project website, which is thefutureswewant.world. So that's easy to remember. Here you'll be able to view all of the visions in full, as well as the opportunity to create and download your own vision of a net zero future that we hope you decide to share and encourage others to do the same. What you've just seen on the previous 2 slides is just what the visions look like. So please do visit the website and have a read. These are across both the 6 regions and the 4 cross-cutting themes. But just to say again, thank you so much, Amy, for sharing the findings of the work. We will now close the live broadcast. So thank you, viewers, for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.